Everybody wants a good, solid, straight, dependable shaft, one that comes easily from the bow when you loose the string. But of course, in this cash-strapped world where money is tight, there are temptations to do things on the cheap. And one of those things is, of course, arrow shafts. But I will say this, and I mean it seriously, do not skimp on your arrow shafts. We've had a lot of people comment, mainly on YouTube, who are new to the sport, that they are making their own bow and of course making their own arrows, which is commendable, but they sometimes mention buying their shafts, or should I say doweling, from DIY stores, home stores and wood merchants and places like that. Now, I'm here to inform you, again very seriously, that doweling is not the same as an arrow shaft. Here, let me explain why. Let's start by looking at the arrow shaft. I say it's an arrow shaft because it's manufactured as an arrow shaft and sold as an arrow shaft. This particular one is made of pine. They come in cedar and other types of wood, but those are the two main materials that are usually used for target type shooting. This one is 5/16, that means the diameter. It's a common diameter, again used in things like target shooting, the normal sport, the archery sport type shooting. The other size that is common is 11/32, that's the next diameter up, so slightly thicker than this, and is used for things like field shooting, where you want a slightly more robust shaft, or is used if you're using a heavier type of bow. So, what's the difference between an arrow shaft and some dowel that you've bought from your local DIY store? Well, for a start, as you can probably see, it doesn't really fit in the frame of the camera here. It's ginormous, it's probably about 7 or 8 foot. Now, obviously this is very tempting. You think, oh, well, I'll get 2 or 3 out of that, and it's only, I think, £2.50, which is probably $3, maybe $4, something like that, for a piece this length. Well, I'll try and explain why you shouldn't. For a start, if you hold them in your hand, if you have got obviously a normal arrow shaft and the dowel, they feel completely different. The dowel isn't finished at all. It's very, very roughly sawn, whereas the arrow shaft is quite well sanded and finished. Also, the shape, the dowel is not round. It really isn't. It's oval at best. And they also tend to have a ridge. The process that they go through of milling these, it's almost like they're done in 2 halves. You can almost feel a ridge either side, almost as if they've squashed 2 bits of wood together. That isn't how they do it, but that's how it feels. So they're not round or anywhere near. The arrow shaft is as round as you're going to get a piece of wood to be. Maybe not as round as a modern aluminium arrow if you're going to get your micrometer out, but they are very good. The other difference, and this is really where we get to the reason why you should not be using this to make arrows, is the grain. Now I'm going to show some pictures here to try and show you the difference in the grain. With an arrow shaft, the grain tends to run, if you're lucky, completely from one end to the other. Now, what do I mean by the grain? Well, if you look closely at any piece of wood, you will see the growth rings of that material. Looking down a shaft, you can actually see the growth rings, the lines of the growth rings, which are like the lines of a sort of train track type lines. If you turn the arrow shaft slightly, you'll see the loops of the grain, the spear shape loops of the grain. Hopefully you can see the grain in this shot. This is the manufactured arrow shaft specifically made for archery, our pine shaft that we've been looking at. You can see that long line of grain there. If I turn it, you can see the loops of the grain, the growth rings. But these lines are the ones we're looking for, and it goes completely along the length of the shaft from end to end, all the way along the 32-inch length of this shaft, all the way up to where my hand is there. So that would be a perfect arrow shaft as far as the actual growth rings go, as far as that grain that we're looking for in the wood. Now, if you're looking at those lines, the train track type lines, as I say, they should, or at least if for a very good shaft, they'll run from one end to the other. Absolute minimum, distance for those lines to be running before they run off the side of the shaft is about 6 inches or so. Now here's a shaft which is an arrow shaft, again specifically made for the sport of archery. Now this one is an example of an arrow shaft where the grain, these long lines of the grain, doesn't run entirely from one end to the other, but is still perfectly acceptable and perfectly usable, as I say, using that rule of thumb of a sort of about a minimum of 6 inch. So you can probably see that I've drawn on in pencil where this actually starts, where the grain, so you've got the loop of the grain here, and you can see where that line, I've followed it all the way along to where it runs out on the opposite side. So that's well within the limit and absolutely fine to use, and in fact pretty much stretches half the length of the shaft. So a good, let's just measure that, that's about 16 inch runoff on the grain on that particular one. Now if we compare that to the grain on this randomly picked out piece of dowel, now you can see the lines of the grain there, they go pretty much at right angles to the wood. They're about probably an inch long. See, there's one end there. You follow the line along, it comes off about here. So about an inch of travel of that grain. So you can see why that's just going to break very, very, very quickly. There's just no strength there in the grain. It's, as I say, running off at, I don't know, a sort of 45-degree angle there. And you can see the knots as well that I was talking about. Absolutely covered in knots. Now, you may be wondering, well, what does that mean? What problem does that cause? Well, unfortunately, that means it's very, very likely to break. Now, the other problem that this is inherent in this cheap material are things like knots, and this is full of knots as well. Now, that's obviously another area that's going to cause problems and very likely make it break. Now, I'm going to try and demonstrate the difference between this arrow shaft and the difference between this piece of dowel. I'm going to cut one to length so it matches the length of this, and I'm going to show you how much you can actually bend this arrow shaft and how little you can bend this dowel before it breaks. I set up these two supports here so that I'm able to lodge an arrow shaft in between them and use this 2-pound weight so that we can actually bend the shaft. This particular shaft is the specific arrow shaft made for archery. It's what we call low spine, so it's actually 28 pounds in spine. So that means the amount of bendiness, which measured on a scale, comes out at around 28. So this would be for a lightweight bow. So let's just put the 2-pound weight on and see what happens. Okay, as you can see, that's bending and it hasn't broken. As I say, this is a lightweight shaft, so this is one of the more bendy shafts, and I'm actually going to put more pressure on there. I wouldn't normally do this because I don't want to break the shaft, but I'll just show you how much flex and how strong that shaft actually is. I'm pushing quite hard on it now and it's still not breaking, no cracking. There we are. That one survived. Now let's do the same to the doweling. This is a piece of doweling, as I say, I've cut to the same length. I'm going to put the weight on and we'll see what happens. Get the picture? As you can see, it didn't take much of a bend before that dowel broke. Now try and imagine if you're actually using that dowel and you're actually shooting with it. So you've drawn the arrow back, and when you let the arrow go, it does an awful lot of bending. I don't know if you've ever seen any slow motion footage of an arrow leaving the bow. It does an awful lot of flexing, So if it breaks as it's going across the top of your hand, then this is particularly with longbow where there's no arrow rest. The arrow literally runs along the top of your hand. If that breaks, that's going to go straight into your hand, and if you're unlucky it could go all over the place and hit other people. Now if wood goes into your hand, obviously that's going to be extremely damaging, extremely painful. There's a lot of tendons and all sorts of things tightly packed into the miracle that is our hand. That could cause an awful lot of damage. Also, when you go to the hospital, as we've had to do with people in the past when incidents have happened, the nurses will point out to you, once you've had the x-ray, they will probably say to you that, well, we can't be sure we've got all the wood out because the x-ray doesn't show it up. So it really, really, really is important that you don't use inferior materials when you're making your arrow shafts. So ultimately, buy your arrow shafts from an archery retailer. That is the best piece of advice that I can really give you. Make sure you go to someone who's reputable, and if you don't know someone who's reputable, talk to fellow archers, your local archery club, or have a look on the internet. You'll soon find people like us who've been doing it a long time, who know what we're doing and know what we're selling. We aren't going to be selling you something that we wouldn't happily use ourselves. I can't speak for all the retailers, but I know that we go through the batch that we get in, we check them, make sure that there aren't any cracks or what have you. Cracks do appear, particularly when the materials are drying out, etc. So we always make sure that when we send you out shafts, if you place an order, that we've checked them thoroughly before we send them out. Well, I hope you found that interesting, and I hope that anyone out there who was considering using doweling has now at least had part of their mind changed. Obviously I can't tell you what to do, but I hope I've explained the dangers of doing so. I'm not trying to frighten anyone, but it just really does worry me that people are still doing this and still talking about doing this and still considering going out and using cheap doweling to make arrow shafts. So one more time, please don't do it. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to see more videos where I promise I'm not always so strict, then please do subscribe. That thing's up on the screen there now, and there's some other videos that you can have a look at. And if you'd like to comment below or shout at me because you think that I'm wrong and that doweling's perfectly safe, then that's entirely up to you. Well, we'll see you again soon.